Greetings, everyone, and welcome to this panel on rising coups in Africa, the road ahead. On September 14, 1960, a young colonel named Joseph Désiré Mobutu staged a coup in then Leopoldville in the Republic of Congo, now known as the Democratic Republic of Congo. He deposed President Joseph Kasavubu and Prime Minister Lumumba. He claimed that that was not a coup, but rather a peaceful revolution. That event 63 years ago set Congo on the course that we all know today. Lumumba will be killed 4 months later on January 17, 1961 in Katanga. This coup will herald a series of coups that will follow through the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. Africa will see a respite, or if you want a break in coups, a respite during the years, the 90s and the 2000s. We thought the page had been turned, especially following what was known in the Francophone space as the Conférence Nationale. But were we mistaken? Were there other conditions that we did not foresee? Today, it's a pleasure to welcome you to this discussion. My name is Mvemba Pezo Dizolele. I'm a senior fellow and the director of the Africa Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. We have aligned a very distinguished panel for us today, which I will introduce, to dissect these issues. We know that coups trigger strong emotions, strong reactions across the entire spectrum. To some, coups are terrible, they should never happen ever. To some, coups are happening because conditions are there to allow them to happen. So today, I would like to welcome Kamisa Kamara, who is a senior advisor for Africa at the US Institute of Peace here in Washington. She is a sub-Saharan Africa policy analyst and practitioner with 15 years of professional experience. She served as Mali's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Digital Economy and Planning, and most recently, Chief of Staff to the President of Mali, the late President of Mali, Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta, who was overthrown in 2020 by Colonel Assimi Koïta, who's now head of the military government in Mali. We are also joined by Beverly Ochieng, who's a senior journalist and Africa analyst with BBC Monitoring. She focuses on insurgencies in West Africa, the Wagner Group involvement in parts of Africa, and political development across the continent. Jeffrey Smith is the executive director of Vanguard Africa. He has over a decade of experience in human rights advocacy, pro-democracy, and research on Africa, including at Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights, Freedom House, the National Endowment for Democracy, and the Institute of Democratic Alternatives in South Africa, as well as UNESCO. Gilles Yabi is the founder and CEO of WATI, the West Africa Citizen Think Tank, which launched in 2015. WATI is a unique participative and multidisciplinary citizen-focused think tank on West African issues. Gilles worked as senior political analyst and later as West Africa project director at the International Crisis Groups. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Let's start with the questions that have kept us going for a while now. Why are these coups happening? What are the conditions setting them? What reaction do we get from the international community? Are this reaction even adequate? So Kamisa, I will turn to you. Please make your remark, and then we go to the rest of the panel. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, Mvemba, for the invitation, and thank you to CSIS for hosting this very important discussion. I will start by saying that, well, reiterating what Mvemba just said, he did say that the military coups do trigger strong reactions. And they do also trigger waves of interrogations, conspiracy theories, widespread anxieties as to the type of instability that they can create. And that is because military coups are shocks to political systems, sometimes of countries that were closely monitored for years. And so this sudden upheaval leaves us grappling with questions of whether these military coups were predictable, or more often how we didn't see it coming. And so I believe that the international community, the media, sometimes even scholars may give the impression that all is well within a particular nation. And one clear example of that is the situation in Mali in 2012, when Mali had this its military coup in 2012. As scholars, policy makers, and observers of the Malian scene all came out very surprised and shocked. And there were headlines like, the Mali is a beacon of democracy gone dark. Well, who told you that Mali was a beacon of democracy? Certainly there was this veneer of stability that was perpetuated by the international partners of Mali. And so beneath this veneer, multiple challenges might be brewing. And at the heart of many coups lie the fraying or outright breaking of the social contract between a government and its citizens. And so when governments neglect, marginalize, oppress significant portions of their populations, or are faced with the impossible task of fulfilling the demand of a growing population for public services, but at the same time tackling a jihadist insurgency that can create fertile ground for upheaval. And so while we may spot these cracks and predict that they will potentially lead to instability, the role of the military in exploiting or mending these cracks is often not interrogated. And so historically, across many nations in Africa, the military has been seen not just as a defense force against external threats, but also as a guardian of national stability. And so in many African countries, post-independence narratives often positioned the military as saviors, as protectors of sovereignty, and even as nation builders. But over time, this view has given military leaders a sense of both responsibility and entitlement to step in when they perceive that the nation is at risk. And so while internal dynamics play a huge role, it's also crucial to acknowledge that there are external influences that sometimes embolden military interventions. From Cold War proxy battles to modern day geopolitics and armed sales, external actors have at times inadvertently or directly given military leaders the belief that they sort of have a green light, or at the very least that they'll face little to no consequences should they seize power. And so as we delve into this topic today, it's essential to approach this issue of military coups in Africa with a nuanced lens, rather than just asking how to prevent military coups. And we've been asking ourselves that question for close to 60 years now, and clearly we still don't have an answer. So that might mean that this is not the right question that needs to be asked. But, and what I'm going to say is very controversial, but we may seek to accept that military leaders have become political actors. And as such, we need to understand their deeper motivations, their histories, their influences, in order to work with them in a rule-based world. And I realize that I just said two completely opposite concepts. A military coup is an illegal seizure of power. A rule-based society is based on rules. Well, when important actors break the rules, we need to understand why they do so. We need to understand why it's so easy for them to do so, but we also need to understand why citizens are accepting of them breaching the rule. And so in conclusion, as we grapple with the phenomenon of coups, it's incumbent upon us to move beyond surface level explanations by deeply understanding the interplay between local dynamics, the role of the military, and external influences. Thank you.
Thank you, Kamisa. I just want to follow up quickly on that. And I think this is part of the challenge that African countries, or any country, really, any polity faces. You said the military might have become political actors, but I will contend that they've always been political actors. They are citizens like anybody else. Having served in the military, I know that I was always a citizen, even when I was under the flag, as we say. So as such, while some of the engagements are mitigated, they are full citizens of the country. They suffer the same socioeconomic hardship or political turbulence that everybody else suffers in the country. So is there perhaps time for us to start reconsidering? You mentioned the role of the military. A lot of the militaries in Africa still carry the colonial DNA. They were created to subjugate the local population, not to uphold the social contract. So just something to keep in mind as we move forward in our discussion, because I think that piece has been missing. If the political system is not working and the civilians are not delivering, they're not just delivering for the civilian, they're also not delivering for the military. So it becomes a problem when the guardians of the republic, so to speak, of the sovereignty of the country, which are both the civilians and the military, if one part of it is not being served, the entire chain is not being served. So sometimes it's very challenging to ask one part of this, one segment of that society, that citizenry, to say you cannot, you don't have, your grievances, we're going to handle them differently. So just something to keep in mind. Beverly, on to you.
I mean, I feel like I agree with quite a lot of what you've said and what Kamisa was saying. And it's from observing even just the recent wave of coups. And I think over the last 4 or 5 years, one of the things that's been happening, stretching from Sudan to Guinea, and now we have Gabon, is whether democracy has failed or it is in retreat, and whether military seizures of power, as Kamisa was pointing out, are a means of resetting broken systems, because armies are supposed to provide security, not just towards external forces, but also internally, as we're seeing, and to protect public institutions. In Sudan, when it happened in 2019, it was after weeks of protests over the rising cost of bread, which then morphed into anger over the lengthy stay of the authoritarian president, Omar al-Bashir. And then in Mali in 2020, it was after those legislative elections where there was a prominent opposition leader who was kidnapped by al-Qaeda militants during campaigns. And there was socio-economic pressure as a result of those insurgencies. And then another coup, of course, when the military rulers themselves were not happy with the transitional government. And that was more of a selfish cause in a way. In Chad, the coup happened as a way of protecting the status quo after Idris Deby suddenly died while fighting rebels, and these rebels were a threat to the transition. So his son, Mahamat, seemed like a palatable choice, even though it wasn't democratic. And then you had later on in Guinea, which was a very belated coup, because we'd seen the protests in 2019, we'd seen President Alpha Conde change the constitution, run for presidency again, win that election, and the public discontent as a result of that. Burkina Faso, the security situation. Niger was a bit of an odd one, because I suppose, in my perception, it could have happened earlier, which is a terrible thing to say, but it happened because the security forces were protecting themselves from scrutiny when there were questions about the defense budget, but it's a country with an insurgency. And in Gabon, it was a way of removing someone, a family that has been there for a long time. So we see that in all these instances, military elites or disgruntled soldiers have taken advantage of political disquiet to give themselves power. And this has, in the majority of cases, been met with some euphoria, because it feels like they're taking back and being able to restore certain institutions, because people are tired of civilian elites, unresponsive democratic institutions. And whether it's, electoral commissions or the judiciary, or even the frustration about social and economic mobility that is not quite meeting what people expect. And these young populations who are quite disgruntled by that. It doesn't legitimize the coups, but it underpins that. And so several of these coups have taken place on the back of mass protests or anger towards the government, but they haven't provided solutions. So in Mali, for instance, violence has been fourfold between 2020 and now. They have tried to change their defense partners, because there has also been anger at international partners, whether it's regional states like the ECOWAS bloc, or even if you're looking at the G5 Sahel force, which has essentially broken down. And then now you have the French forces who've been forced to leave. And then you're looking at places like Guinea, where the military or Mamadou Doumbouya came in waxing lyrical about changing the constitution, about representing people, but he has held on to power and not been held adequately accountable by those institutions that are supposed to ensure that there is a democratic transition. In Chad, there was the extension of military rule by 2 years, and we still see Mahamat is very close to the US, very close to France. So, there's the questions about which coups have been seen as acceptable, which ones are seen as being destabilizing. But ultimately, what we are seeing is there is some degradation of democratic institutions. Media freedoms are also, being eroded. We're not sure if elections are going to take place in many of these countries to make sure that there's a handover of power to civilian rule. And then at some point, you find that even those who are supporting those juntas, like in Mali today, there was this activist who had been backing the junta through and through in the public, in the radio, on various platforms. And now he's also being charged with undermining the state. So when these militaries take power, change institutions, maybe change the laws, like have referenda or change the electoral code, and there's a lack of external accountability, it becomes a problem and it feeds into itself. So we find that more militaries might be emboldened to reset democratic institutions by seizing power, because they are also a center of power, which could be in competition with democratic institutions, with leaders who have been elected, as we're seeing in many of these cases.
Thank you very much, Beverly. From what you say, I think we go back to that coup on 14 September 1916 in Congo. Coups typically reset the system, or at least the real world of experience that is happening. In the 60s, the 70s, coups were also couched in what Kamisa just mentioned, the geopolitics of the time, Cold War and so on. But then we went to this period in the 90s, particularly to the Conférence Nationale. Kenya experienced this. Benin was the leader of this kind of process. Zambia was right front and center. Have we failed somewhere? It looks like we failed somewhere. The talks of the democracy, the several election cycle that we've seen, I would like to revisit that again when we get into our discussion. Now I'll turn to Jeffrey Smith.
Great. Thank you so much. I think obviously the first day of a coup is always the happiest, most euphoric day, as Beverly was just discussing. But then, of course, the reality quickly sets in, and people are always asked, or forced to ask themselves, rather, are we getting something better, or simply trading one oppressor for another? And I think with that framing, there are some key issues for me and some misperceptions that I think we should address at the outset. Number one, I've seen the argument made frequently that the coup in Gabon and the 9 others or 7 others, depending on whom you talk to in the region since 2020, were caused by a failure of democracy. I completely reject that notion, because number two, sham elections rigged by autocrats do not equal democracy. I think the meaning of democracy in this way has been warped and is rightly being called into question by those who have experienced plenty of elections or electoral processes, but little in the way of real political choice or accountability. And then the third related issue is that military coups, even if they oust a longtime dictator, they rarely usher in democracy. And we can get into a bit more of that later on. But number four, I don't think we shouldn't confuse coups for popular uprisings, right? They are vastly different. And the latter has a much better success rate at ushering in genuine democracy as opposed to the latter. And number five, and something I think we need to insert into this conversation, is that we must not accept the charade that today's coup leaders represent the people. And in so doing, I think we need to push back against this idea that democracy is somehow a Trojan horse for neocolonialism or part of some nefarious Western agenda. To me, it's both misleading and also patronizing to suggest that democracy has been imposed when in fact we all know that it has been demanded and fought for from below for generations now. So the broader context, and I think, is this: it's despite what many people have assumed, especially on social media, which I'm sure all of us have seen, is that coups are not backed by popular demand, nor are they embraced by citizen populations. I was this week in a very fascinating briefing by Afrobarometer, which I'm sure many listeners are familiar with, and their latest survey data, and it showed that 2/3 of Africans say they want democracy and 67% disapprove of military rule. But to Camisa's point, there are serious red flags. Only 44% of Africans say elections enable voters to remove leaders that voters do not want. So there really is this prevailing sense of marginalization, of disillusionment and dissatisfaction. And there's a fundamental problem of governance quality, what I would call the supply side of democracy. So I think we can't deny that coups sometimes represent a glimmer of hope, albeit fleeting, for masses living under dictatorship. And this is why, again, according to Afrobarometer's latest data, a slim majority, actually 53%, are willing to endorse military intervention if elected leaders abuse their power, particularly amongst the youth population ages 18 to 35. And we recently had a blog post published over at Vanguard Africa written by Togolese activist Frida Nabarima, and I think she summed this up really nicely, and I'm just going to read it. She wrote, the term democracy has been co-opted by political gangsters who have come to power through corruption, manipulation of institutions, voter suppression, ballot stuffing, and violence against the people. And I think that's something we really need to consider. But the other issue I would really like to insert into this conversation today is for me, a big elephant in the room. And that's the fact that we need to confront the reality that despots and dictators have routinely gotten away with sham elections, or electoral coups, in other words, as the recent charades just this year in Sierra Leone, in Zimbabwe, and Gabon so visibly illustrate. And I think there's much blame to go around, including a generation of African leaders who have not lived up to the standards that they themselves have drafted, have signed, and have ratified through multiple regional and international conventions. But sitting here next to Washington, I think we have to look inward as well. I think Washington has been woefully ineffective and inconsistent in their responses to coups in various forms, whether they are electoral, constitutional, or military. And again, to Camisa's point, there's a much more permissive environment today than there was several years ago. If you look at the spate of recent coups, a common theme in each of them has been emboldened militaries realizing that they are likely to face little to no resistance for their actions. And this wasn't always the case. Washington used to place pretty big consequences on coup leaders. If you go back to the coup in Mauritania in 2008, in Guinea in 2009, following the stadium massacre, in Mali after the coup in 2012, in Guinea-Bissau and CAR in 2012 as well. But that pressure now is mostly gone. But there's also been no explanation for this departure from precedent. Of course, this is not to say that these actions will prevent coups. They will not. But it certainly increases the pressures on would-be coup plotters by making them think twice about their actions. And I think likewise, under both Republican and Democratic administrations, this is a bipartisan issue. There has been a failure to address, again, the rising instances of electoral coups, what I would call the soft bigotry of low expectations. And why does this matter? Why do I keep bringing this up? And it's because electoral coups often lead to military coups down the line. You look at Zimbabwe, a stolen election in 2008. You have a coup in 2017. Guinea, you have what many people would argue was a stolen election in 2020, a coup in 2021. And most recently, Gabon, of course, a brazenly rigged election in 2016, again in 2023, and a coup several months later, or immediately thereafter, rather. In some, I would say, unfortunately, the U.S. government appears untroubled by the notion that elections that would not pass muster in the major powers or even here are somehow acceptable in Africa. And I think this is, number one, highly disrespectful and obviously an unsustainable path to continue down. And just really quickly to close out, I think in light of these current realities, we have to ask what can be done instead of just admiring these problems. What are some of the potential solutions that I'm sure we'll get into a bit more later? But what I think we can do first and foremost is empower the masses, average citizens, civil society, the democratic opposition, leaders in the diaspora, those living in exile, to take advantage of any opportunity. And this includes coups, to rise up peacefully and to demand dignity, to build institutions that safeguard the fundamental tenets of democracy that have been lacking. And I think this can be accomplished by building up institutions, both social and political, because to be strong, of course, government effectiveness must grow in strength alongside citizen power. So along with that, we must help to enhance the capabilities of political institutions, legislatures, judiciaries, the independent media. And of course, I think first and foremost, independent electoral commissions that are properly equipped and supported to enhance citizens' trust and legitimacy of electoral outcomes. And just to wrap up, I think African leaders, but also their development partners and supporters worldwide will have really let the continent down if the trail forward is merely posed as this false choice between military coups or rigged elections. And I think I think we'd be making a really grave mistake if we write off the importance of democracy while remaining flippant and passive about democratic governance and all that entails for stability and quality of life. Because we know that the longing for democracy is poignant. The quest stretches across 6 decades now. And empirical evidence, as I mentioned with Afrobarometer and other polling data, is clear. When Africans have a voice, they choose democratic governance over every other option, including one man and military rule. So the evidence is overwhelming, and despite the anecdotes, the disinformation, the propaganda we see daily on social media, if we can work on the supply side of democracy, again, on that supply side of democracy, and also unapologetically support democratic leadership, I think that is where the solution should be.
Thank you, Jeffrey. A couple of things that I want to raise with you to think about is this gap, of course, between the promotion of democracy, quote unquote, and what's happening on the ground. We've worked with democratic institutions for a long time. We've observed elections. We've seen people mobilize. Yeah, we've been told military coups are bad. Do not rally around them. We see more and more the youth actually rallying around those things. The piece you mentioned by Farida Nabureima talk about the misunderstanding of African youth, not understanding them exactly where their needs are. We are told civilians should mobilize and they can then vanquish dictatorship. A great example has been Sudan. We've seen the Sudanese people, rural, urban, youth, professional, everybody mobilize in a way we've not seen in any African country, really. And that has failed. Are there double standards? If this had been in Poland, this had been in Ukraine, this had been in the Czech Republic, or wherever else, the West, the donors put a lot of funds into this process. And often these things lead to some good outcome. We've not seen that level of support in Africa. And then we see the condemnation 50 years, 60 years later, African countries across the board are still waiting for that day. Not that they're not mobilizing, they've been mobilizing, and then they face this incoherence from the Western partners. We see this in the messaging and so on. So something for you to think about as we go to the next round. Gilles, welcome, and on to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mvemba and CSIS for this invitation. I think I could just say, well, thank you. They said it all, because I think the three predecessors were extremely clear, and I think they almost said it all. But I guess that it would be too easy for me just to to say that. I have nothing to add, so I will add maybe a few thoughts. I think. The first is this, of course, a lot of comment about the speed of coup, even the contagion, the epidemic of coup d'etat on the continent. And I think that it might limit the perception of the diversity of political situation that we are talking about. And I think Beverly made it very clear by talking in detail about different situations. I think it's very different to talk about Sudan, for example, where you have a long history of authoritarian and military rule, and actually it is a fight for first real democratic government to happen in the country. It's very different from the situation in Mali or Burkina Faso in the Sahel. And even if you take Guinea, it is also a different combination of factors that I think explain the coup d'etat. So I think it is very important really to keep in mind that all African countries, as you know, all countries in the world, have their own political history, their own political trajectory, and that is the main determinant explanation of what is happening at one point. And when we have coup, we have to look at those very national and local factors. At the same time, yes, there is possible contagion, which is basically the signal which is given to military officers when you are coup in 2 or 3 countries. Well, you know that it is possible, you know the kind of reaction that you can get, and you know that actually it can work. And if you know that you can have significant support from the population, it's always very difficult to evaluate that support. But I think it would be wrong to think that there is no popular support for some of the coups. So when the military officers get the signal that it is possible, internally, but also it is possible given international reaction and given the current geopolitical context, then yes, definitely a coup in one country can also trigger passage à l'acte, I would say in French, action in other countries. Second point is that I think what the countries have in common, and that's actually, of course, something worrying because I think it means that we can have more coups over signs of political instability in other countries on the continent. Because I think what they share is this political trajectory of being young states. I think it is very important, especially for international audience, to just clarify the fact that we are talking about countries that have 60, 70 years as independent states in their current borders. And that has a lot of implication of what was the challenge of building states, building democratic state, which is not the same thing, in my opinion, building nations, building societies, diverse societies, understanding that they belong to a single nation state or single kind of political institution. That was a huge challenge. And I think that the fact that Mvemba mentioned the coup in Congo was very interesting because, of course, back to what happened in Congo, you can see the combination of internal factors, legacy of colonialism, but also the fact that you have people with ambitions and you have external factors as well, especially when we are talking about countries that have a lot of resources. You cannot talk about Gabon, for example, the history of Gabon, without talking about the resources of Gabon, without talking about how, from the very beginning, France decided to select the kind of leadership that you wanted to secure access to the resources of Gabon. So again, there are a lot of commonalities that make it actually possible to have a lot of fragility in other countries that are not actually experiencing coup d'etat now. The third thing is, I think Jeffrey rightly clarified that it is very important. I fully agree with him. The comment that about failure of democracy, I think, is totally wrong because, it's probably a failure to implement real democracy. So we cannot say that democracy failed when you do not have democracy in these countries. And I think it is very important to clarify that because what I think people are saying in these countries by applauding coup is that they are not happy with the way the countries have been managed. And they are not happy with the economic and social conditions they are living in. It's not a theoretical debate about democracy. It is an issue of people who are not satisfied with the state of a country. And I think the challenges of the problem is that the economic situation now in any country of the continent is not the result of the last 5 years. It is the result of the last 2 or 3 decades. And that's where you have a real problem because the youth are not satisfied with the conditions, but of course they can't necessarily understand that you don't have quick fix to that. You won't have a significant improvement of economic and social conditions in just a few years. Even with a very good government, you won't get that. And that, I think, one of the reason why we need to really to work a lot in terms of explaining also the fact that, coup can only aggravate economic and social conditions that are actually one of the main reasons why people are applauding coups. And the final observation is, the distinction on the issue of building democracy and building efficient states. I think that we cannot be worried only about democracy. I'm a strong supporter of democracy, but we have to talk about the economy. We have to talk about strategic interests. We have to talk about the foreign policy of democratic states. And the foreign policy of the US or France or over state, I can see really a lot of democratic components in these foreign policies, and they have an impact also on the current situation on many countries of the continent. So my point is that I think we really need to work on the issue of building strong democracy, but also building efficient state, because we need public policies, and countries that are not democratic, like China, for example, in the takeovers, at least we are providing something to the citizen in terms of security, in terms of economic and social goods. And I think that, again, the challenge on the continent is not only building democratic states, it's also about building efficient state that produce results for the people. So I would stop here.
Thank you, Gilles. For you, I think I want for you to think a little bit of, Jeffrey referred to Afrobarometer survey. Everybody's referring to those quite a bit. But I also get a sense we pick and choose what part of the survey we want to highlight, right? The survey also shows that there's a decrease in opposition to coups in Africa. In other words, these are not contradiction, right? It's on one level, people want democracy, they want good governance, they want transparency. But those 19-year-old, 17-year-old, even those of us who are older, have not seen a lot of places that have worked in Africa over the last several years, right? So we start wondering when exactly Godot is going to come, right? It's like we're waiting for Godot. People are working hard to change, and change is not happening. So it's also interesting, Gilles, that you mentioned the intellectual debate, because a lot of the debate we're having are very theoretical. And people in the street of Niamey, people in Libreville, in Bamako, are not having this political scientist debate. That's not what's happening. They're just having face-to-face the reality that there's every day. So I would like for you to think a little bit about this notion of having one size fits all response to all coups. Coups bad, therefore, and the ramification of that. Every time we have this so-called strong stance against coup, are we missing opportunities in those early days? Those are the golden hours, right? Golden hours when the crisis just happened. When we come so strongly on one side, is that also a lost opportunity in trying to engage? ECOWAS sends an ultimatum that nobody believed would be possible. I just returned from Nigeria. I've yet to meet a single Nigerian who believed that made sense. Yeah. Then you have leaders, of course, who are struggling at home. I'm talking about Cote d'Ivoire, I'm talking about Senegal and others whose record are not necessarily that one we want to talk about often, who are very sanguine and very bullish on changing these coups. So that's something just I want for you to go. So when I take the second round, Kamisa, I gave you your question. So can you respond to those?
Yes, you said that you believe that military leaders have always been political actors, and I'm going to have to push back a little bit. I think that there is a reason why presidents are the supreme commander of the armed forces, and they're not the supreme commander of the citizens. The army is accountable to the highest institution, the highest office of the state. And a coup is by definition the breakdown of that relationship between the institution that is supposed to protect the president and his office and the president himself. And I cannot help but, just remember what happened in August 2020 when the military literally stepped into the president's living room in Bamako to take him physically away from his home with the prime minister and take him to the military garrison. That was a confirmation that the president's office was no longer, that the president was no longer president. And to me, because it's shocking to all of us, it also shows that military officers are not just regular citizens. They have this high responsibility towards, again, the highest institution of the country and towards the country that a regular citizen does not have. You've also mentioned that in some of those cases, the military has been neglected. In the case of Mali, I have to say that the contrary happened. I think there was too much attention placed on the military, on rebuilding the military. Over 30% of Mali's national budget up until the coup of 2020 was devoted to the military. We almost doubled the military salaries. There were special education programs for the children of military officers who would die in combat. And so, but this was done while neglecting other very important public services, education, health, etc. And it is those services which turned against the president and claiming that there was a lack of governance, and the military used that as their primary motivation to conduct the coup. So it's not such a simple relationship between the military and the institutions of the country. And to me, the way the military have been set up, at least on paper, they're not supposed to be political actors. They're supposed to serve the president, no matter what side the president is on, who he is, what political party he represents. And this is why military actors are supposed to be apolitical, at least on paper. But this is not what they have demonstrated when they have conducted those coups.
Thank you very much, Kamisa. So that still goes to the heart of my question. It's time to rethink the relationship between the military and the civilian leadership. So your definition was that the military is there to serve the president. I'll contend that the military is there to serve the people, not the president, because this is also part of what we have in a lot of African countries. Is the president is the commander in chief, but the military is not his, right? It's the people's army. So as such, the force that you just, so there's a symbiotic relationship with, yeah, all the funding that you gave the military to increase all the things, which created an imbalance in the rest of the budget. That is true. Then they become favored on one level. But then two, they are still part of that society where all these other issues are happening, right? So that's, I think there's still ground here for us to say, what kind of military are we going to have? Is the Committee on Armed Forces in the Malian Parliament, are they working to help with those relationships or not? You know, it's not just the president, the military. There's an entire spectrum, as you know, that goes. So I think that those issues also we need to look at, because as I said, these are colonial armies that have tried to transform, and sometimes we know it's an army of the north that is dominated by one ethnic group that date from the days of the colonial. Sometimes it's the guys from the east, sometimes it's an army of Christians or Muslims. So I take your point, but my point is simply, we have to reset a lot of these relationships. So security sector reform, along with the socioeconomic element that Gilles was mentioning, become really key. And a lot of these countries have never had this security sector reform. We just kind of transition from colonial army to changing the name. So thank you very much. Beverly, on to you.
It's actually an interesting thing about the point about security sector reforms, because one of the reasons Sudan erupted the war that's going on now was because they were attempting those security sector reforms as a way of eventually handing over power to civilians. But because the army itself was uncomfortable about that center of power shifting from them, because even though Bashir was a civilian leader in essence, the military had a lot of economic and social interests. And that's been the case in, you know, a country like Chad, for instance, which is why Deby came in through a coup, his son came in through a coup. The military has had vested interests. They installed people who they felt would protect those interests. And that's, you know, when you think about the army as a political actor in response to that, and even what you'd asked me earlier, it's, yes, it is politicized because it is a stakeholder in what's happening. In a country where there's an insurgency, for instance, they do have people who are affected by that. They're in the front line, they're fighting against whether it's rebel groups or militant groups or even political forces who might be threatening that power, as we are seeing now in Niger or even in Gabon. So they're so entangled with each other because of the way our institutions work. We were handed over, you know, after colonialism and independence, we were handed over these things, but we have to also define them for ourselves and look at those specific circumstances that then lead to those coups or lead to those interventions. I think military intervention is always the phrase that I think about a lot, because it is a response to some degree of disgruntlement. But in terms of, you know, have they been able to, when we talk about what democratic credentials are, democratic institutions, and whether there will be reform under militaries, yes, it doesn't look like there's the possibility of that in some of the countries that we're watching. And constitutional coups are also another way of subverting power, because if you look at Guinea, there was an election in essence, there was a referendum, but there were protests against that process because people didn't feel it represented them. And then what Jeffrey was saying about how the West or other institutions will have a fairly low bar of what passes as African democratic institutions or empowerment. ECOWAS had been issuing the same statement when there were protests in Guinea, and then the coup came to them as a surprise, even though there had been that long-running disgruntlement, which the public felt they hadn't adequately responded to. Same case in Mali with 2020, and even these institutions themselves are being challenged about what they represent. The African Union has essentially all but been expelled from Sudan. And even though it's a slightly different circumstance, we saw also in Ethiopia when the war happened, it was challenging. What do those institutions represent when it comes to upholding democratic ideals and credentials? Are they able to see the warning signs of this? Of course, there's the issue of sovereignty, and when do you then step in and intervene politically before military then steps in and takes power and consolidates it for themselves? Is the harsh response by those institutions a remedy for it? So far, it doesn't look like it, because then you end up with hardline stances and no way of being able to negotiate diplomatically any way to a meaningful transition. So it's been very complicated, and it's very interesting watching it now, because yes, hearing about the coups from way before and then now watching those institutions that had been strengthened through the 90s and the early 2000s sort of falling back into decay also goes back to whether people see themselves being represented. A younger population growing up in a situation where they don't see themselves being able to be close to power because elections are, seen to be a sham, or they're not able to get the socioeconomic educational situation to put them in a better position, is part of the underlying reasons this is happening. And militaries are also riding on it.
Thank you very much, Beverly. I think that goes to the core of a lot of these issues, right? These institutions, the relationship between them, and what we do about them. So thank you. Jeffrey, back to you. The response of the West, how do we engage? Do we expect Africans to deliver everything on their own? And then when these things, the dream of democracy, the aspiration doesn't happen, we blame them. But when we observe in other parts of the world, we actually invest a lot in making sure that that process, the Velvet Revolution, the Rose Revolution, and all this revolution actually achieve something. And then we also pump in money to support the economic backing that is required for that. Are there double standards here?
Yeah, I'm so glad we're having this discussion, because to Beverly's point, it is so complex. And Mvemba, I take your point about, the rising dissatisfaction of citizens in a lot of these countries, including particularly amongst the youth population. And to your point, that was borne out in some of the Afrobarometer data, where I believe it was 13 out of 30 countries surveyed actually showed a decline in support for their country's democratic institutions. But there are reasons for that, some of which we got into today. And, just to say, just to add my own complexity to this, my stance is pretty clear as I outlined at the beginning. But, I have to be honest, I've worked with human rights defenders and activists and even, members of the political opposition in countries like Cameroon and Togo and Equatorial Guinea, Congo, Brazzaville for about a decade now. And to a person, I doubt any of them would be mourning the loss of the dictators that have been in power in the case of Equatorial Guinea since 1979. There'd be very little mourning, for that, very little lamenting for that. But I think, we always have to continue to underscore the fact that military coups are not a savior for democracy. That has been the hope for many activists from the 1970s until today. But in my estimation, and I'd be open to other opinions on this almost never materializes. I could think in Vemba, we were having a quick discussion yesterday about this, and Portugal was really the only country that came to mind of an actual success story, if we were to define it as that. And this is because, coups are not viable replacements or fill-ins for popular uprisings, or not a replacement for free and fair elections in which people actually have their say and their votes actually counted and defended. And why is this? I think one of the reasons is because coups are often elitist, self-serving endeavors. Political power shifting from one autocrat to another, albeit in military fatigues, is not a win for the people. I think a really great example is Gabon. And you look at the junta leader there, he's a distant cousin of the ousted Bongo with $1 million properties, including right down the street here from me in Silver Spring, Maryland, and holdings abroad. In this way, it was a continuity coup. It was a palace coup, in which very little will change other than the figurehead at the top benefiting from the state's massive resources. And I think also it's important to remind people of Beverly's point that, she made the point about, the coup regime in Mali and the fact that violence has worsened. Terrorist attacks have actually increased. Zimbabwe is another great example. Many of my friends and people that I've worked with for a long time were out celebrating in the streets in November 2017 when Mugabe was toppled by Emerson Mnangagwa, the president who has now been reelected, and I'll put that in air quotes. Reelected to another term, and many people are wishing they were back in the days of Mugabe, one of the worst despots that the African continent has ever known, and they're wishing they could go back to a time when he was in power, because Mnangagwa and the military regime in power there has just been so abusive, oppressive, and corrupt. So I think in sum, Africans don't think the idea of military rule is great, but the leaders who are supposed to be Democrats are not abiding by the rules of democracy, and people across the continent are rightly wondering what's in this system for me, and I don't think we should discount that, and I think that's a serious red flag that we need to consider going forward. There really is a widening fissure between Africa's anti-democratic leaders, whether elected or otherwise imposed, in the hopes and demands of the citizens over which they rule. And as this gap continues to spread, so too does the volatility of an already young and restive region that are fed up with empty promises. And it's why I say I would not be surprised at all if we saw another coup in the region sometime this year. I think the conditions are just too ripe for that. But really quickly, I think another really important point to insert into this conversation, one that hasn't been raised yet, is the issue of precedent. And this adds urgency to it, because the biggest predictor of whether a coup will happen in any given country is precedent. History has shown us that coups beget more coups, and many people will point to Niger as well as Mali in 1991 as counterexamples to this, until of course they weren't. And coups have a compounding multiplier effect. That's another consideration. As leaders hang on to power for longer in Burkina Faso, in Guinea, in Mali, and other countries, the longer they hang on to power or seizing it by force, the more influence they have, of course, in regional and international organizations, which further deteriorate the democratic norms that previously stood. So there really appears to be a new playbook. It's you seize power, you hang on to it long enough to hold elections and to win those by hook or by crook, use electoral manipulation and other resources to do so, and then sit back and relax as sanctions on your regime, even if they are imposed, are ultimately lifted. So I think that's the predicament.
But what about the gap? Do you think there are double standards in the way we engage African countries? Because in the case of Mali in 91, the military held on to power for 1 year. They organized the election, and by all indicators, State Department and others, Mali was a nascent democracy. Mali did not get the type of support that Poland or Czech Republic or anybody else got. So ultimately, we could predict it back then that there's going to be another coup, the thing is going to fall. Can you address that quickly so we can go to Jim?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the U.S. government currently and going back several administrations need to stand up and walk the talk. We have routinely, and when I say we, I mean our government, have routinely talked a great game on democracy, on free and fair elections, on respect for human rights, and improving the quality of life, but we have not enacted the measures in a sustainable way in order to accomplish that. And that is why we see that widening fissure between the supply side for democracy, which remains lacking, and the demand side. And I think that's the gap in which we have to be operating and we have to be looking at. And hopefully these sorts of conversations will lead to solutions toward that. I mentioned several of them. And I think, again, a key point to underscore is that we have to deal with the reality as it is, right? And I think what we can do is really empower the masses and allow them to take advantage of opportunities, including coups, including military coups, to rise up peacefully and to demand that dignity that they've been denied, to build institutions that safeguard the fundamental tenets of democracy. I mentioned several of them, including, independent and impartial electoral commissions. Too often, incredibly partisan, biased, incapable electoral institutions are supported by some of the same Western organizations that are denouncing sham elections. So there's a contradiction there. And I think certainly to your point, our government can be doing a much better job to support Democrats as opposed to the anti-Democrats who are subverting the system that we ostensibly want to support now and going forward.
All right. Thank you very much, Jeffrey. Gilles, on to you.
Yeah, well, a lot of issues, of course. I think first of all, I was thinking about what Jeffrey just said. Thinking about Gabon, for example. Yes, I think it is extremely dangerous to talk about good coup. I don't think that you have good coup, but I think that we should admit that there are coups that are worse than others, and we should also see the reality. Today, it is clear that it is a palace coup in Gabon, but most of the Gabonese are happy to have a change. And maybe there is an opportunity, irrespective of the ambitions of the general who is in power, there is an opportunity to do something, to actually work for a real democratic change. There is no guarantee that it will happen. But what was sure is that if you have Ali Bongo re-elected, it was sure that people can't see any way out. So I think we should also really face that reality that, when you have a situation where a significant portion of the population, let's even say just only 20% of urban population of a country, would be ready to applaud a coup. I think when you get to that situation, you have a signal which is given to military officers that they can make a coup, and that they will be able to be applauded by people. And it means that, you can have a coup and you can't do anything actually about it. So this issue really of facing, I think, the reality of this frustration of the people is important, and seeing coup as an opportunity as long as you already have coup, so you can denounce them, you can condemn them, but the issue now is how to make sure that it is an opportunity to do something substantial. Also, when there was the first coup in Burkina Faso, toppling President Kabore, who was elected, you have a feeling that insecurity, that the country was collapsing. If you are in Washington, D.C., and you have, the entire United States, in disorder, sense of collapse, and then you are seeing the threats coming to your house, to your neighborhoods, I'm not sure that you won't have a lot of people around who would be ready, to accept a general who would say, well, I'm the head of the army and the president is not taking the right decisions to counter this situation, and I'm the one who will be able to protect your lives. I'm not sure that actually people will be saying that, okay, our first priority is protecting democracy and not protecting our security. Even it is wrong, the reality, I think, of a perception, especially in Burkina Faso, when the first coup happened, was a sense of collapse and incapacity of the elected government to provide results. So I think that is also the reality, and I'm coming back to what I already said. I think people want democracy, they want freedom, but also they want their own security. And when we are talking about the country in the Sahel, I think we should really understand that these call for security, for economic and social benefits is as important as the call for democratic leadership. And maybe a final point about elections. Also, I think it is, of course, extremely important to work on improving electoral frameworks in the African countries. But I think we should also think about the reality that even with free and fair and credible election, I'm not sure that it would guarantee good leadership that we provide results. And if we consider that the main reason for coup is what is delivered to the people in terms of security, in terms of economic and social benefits, it means that even with good elections, I'm not sure that actually we'll be necessarily in a bitter situation. So my point is that we need to work on the other components of democracy, not only on elections. And I think the other components is everything about the funding of political parties, the kind of political system that we have in place, the incentives that are embedded in the institutions, the neutrality of a public administration. So there are so many things that I think are essential conditions for African countries to have both democratic leadership, but also efficient states, as I said before.
Well, thank you very much to our panelists. What I take from all of you is that the road ahead is going to be difficult and pretty bumpy. The realities on the ground, particularly in the Sahel, is a reality that is particularly shaped by conflict, armed conflict. And so long as that armed conflict is not over, we'll continue to see coups. Jeffrey, I very much take your point. I think we'll have more coups. Our responses have been inadequate. I think one coup, one size fits all doesn't work because, like Gilles said, every country has a different history. Burkina Faso has been having coups since I was a kid. Yeah, and I remember even doctors stage coup in Burkina Faso. You know, they've been medical doctors, military doctors with stage coup. So it's a long tradition. As long as democracy we don't support them, it's not going to happen. Beverly, we talked about the disgruntlement of young people, the lack of socioeconomic opportunities. Security sector reform is a problem. The West conducts a lot of foreign assistance program in AFRICOM and others, but just training and training and training does not mean that deep inside every Malian officer, there is an American officer waiting to get out. And then when a coup happens, we all surprise and say, after all the trainings, we cannot believe they staged a coup. Well, they're good officers, they got the training, their context is totally different. So our training is not going to prevent them from staging a coup. What will create a disincentive for coups will be the support on the other side, good governance, socioeconomic package, and so on. So on that note, I'd like to thank you all. Kamisa had to leave a little earlier. So Kamisa Kamara, Beverly Ochieng, Jeffrey Smith, Gilles Yabi, thank you very much for joining us today. And thank you very much to our audience joining us from various parts of the world. Thank you very much. We conclude this session.